Okay. Good afternoon. Great pleasure to have you with us in today's session of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of the COVID-19. We've launched the series back in April. What we had in mind is to discuss concepts that are currently not mainstream and may or perhaps should become mainstream in the aftermath of COVID-19. Today is the 10th session, and it's a pleasure to have with us Eli Abu-Aoun. Eli is the director of the MENA program of the United States Institute of Peace, USIP, with us. Eli will talk about a timely topic: fragility, eroded social contract, trust deficits, and polarity in the aftermath of COVID-19. He's joining us from Tunis. Now, let me tell you brief about him. Before joining USIP, Eli was the director of the Arab Human Rights Fund. Prior to that, he was a director and program manager of the Danish Refugee Council in Iraq. He spent time working on the program coordinator for a Danish NGO called Okinden in Iraq. And he was also with a Lebanese NGO called Arsensiel. Eli is a senior trainer, consultant for various international organizations since 1996. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Notre Dame University in Lebanon, Saint Joseph University in Lebanon, on the topics of human rights, civil society, advocacy, and citizenship. He holds an MBA, and he's also a doctor of dental surgery. Without much ado, let me just tell you the rules. Eli's gonna talk for 25 minutes. And then after that, we're gonna have rounds of questions. If you have a question, you're gonna need to type it on the chat box. And then around 3 o'clock, we'll wrap up. So Eli, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali. And hello, everyone. I hope you're all safe and sane. I'd like first to start by thanking the Gerhard Center and Dr. Ali for offering me this opportunity. I've attended a couple of these webinars early on, and I found them very useful. So thank you for organizing this series of webinars, and thank you for having me on one of them. So just in case some people are not familiar with the Institute, I'd like to start by introducing a little bit our work in the region. So the U.S. Institute of Peace was established by the Congress in 1984 as an independent bipartisan organization with the aim of preventing and mitigating violent conflict. Our mission is basically, as I said, to prevent and mitigate violent conflicts outside of the United States. And this nuance is very important today, given what's happening inside the United States. But our mandate is to work exclusively outside of the US. And we usually do it through 3 types of programming. We have a lot of capacity building programs to both governmental and non-governmental entities. We have a number of community dialogue models that we've developed over the years and that we apply depending on the context. Some of them are aiming at facilitating the relationship between security actors and local communities. Others are more about transitional justice in a post-conflict setting, or interfaith dialogue, or any different topics. And the third programmatic track is the informing policy one. So through our research and publications, we try to inform policies and to engage policymakers in the region and in the US at the same time. So this is in a nutshell who we are and what we do in the region. And now I don't want to take a lot of time to discuss the Institute's work, so I'll move on to the presentation itself. Next slide, please. So my presentation today is about fragility and conflict in the aftermath of COVID. Obviously, a lot of the fragility elements that I'm going to discuss pre-existed before the pandemic. So, so next slide, please. If we look at this slide, it summarizes a little bit the 6 main pillars that I'm going to address today. So economic hardship, rise in unemployment, and how this feeds into fragility. I'll go through intra-community tensions. And we're seeing in several places that this is deepening, and the divides are actually deepening. I talk about the impact of the pandemic on migration and vulnerable groups, and then how the grievances are developing at the community level, at the grassroots level, then how the crisis is being exploited by some state and non-state actors, and last but not least, the global and regional orders. So how the global and regional orders are affected by the pandemic. And as I said before, all of these key factors pre-existed. So there's nothing new that is coming with the pandemic, but the pandemic is just exacerbating all of these factors, and I'm going to give a few examples. On this slide, there's a bit of a focus on the economic impact and how it leads to a myriad of other problems. So unemployment and unemployment rises, and then the fragility is increased. This will lead to more extremism, more human rights violations, and obviously this will fuel the violent conflicts in the region. So this is more or less the chain reaction that we're seeing in many places. Next slide, please. So in terms of social impact, as I said, we are seeing intra-community tensions becoming more obvious and exacerbated. From our work, for example, we know that in Iraq, in northeastern Syria, and in Libya, the tension that pre-existed before the pandemic is now taking a different turn. So we're seeing, larger space being offered for radical voices within each of the communities. There are even accusations that some communities are carriers of the virus more than others. Some accusations fall within the conspiracy theories as well. And obviously, the fact that the authorities are busy with responding to the pandemic is also giving more space to non-state actors, to our non-state actors more specifically, to fuel these tensions. On the other hand, we're seeing also an eroded social contract. Well, first of all, the social contracts in many countries in the region, or the status of the social contracts in many places in the region was not great. We all follow how the social contract collapsed in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen, and other places. What we're seeing today is an erosion of the social contracts in places where it was somehow holding. And I'll take one example is Tunisia, for example. There is a growing sense of anger and grievances developing at the grassroots level. The anger is pretty much focusing on the fact that the government is not able to fulfill the expectations of the population. Now, whether these expectations are realistic or not doesn't really matter at this stage. I'm just describing something we're seeing at the grassroots level. Before the pandemic, we all saw and followed some protests and social movements in several countries in the region, Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq more specifically. And obviously, now we can realize how detrimental the pandemic was on the dynamics of these social movements and on the potential for these social movements to actually lead to real change. People have different priorities right now, although the reasons for these social movements or protests are still there, if not even more. But the ability of the protest groups and the mobilizers actually among these groups has been hindered by the pandemic. Next slide, please. So when it comes to refugees and IDP communities, obviously the pandemic hits at several levels in this case. Well, first of all, there is the already precarious or poor conditions inside the camps or informal settlements of IDPs and refugees. And a pandemic like this will definitely increase the demand on, increase the demand for additional healthcare services. And with the international community's attention being diverted towards other priorities, the needs were not addressed in many cases. And then the other thing in this specific case is that social distancing is impossible in these cases, and the likeliness of having a very widespread of the virus is very high. We are also really worried about secondary waves of displacement as a result of the ongoing military operations. And we've seen, I'll cover this a bit later, we've seen escalation in Libya, in Syria, and in some places of Iraq that are causing displacement. And in this context of pandemic, a secondary wave of displacement is really problematic. And one issue that is not on the slide, but that is quite specific to the to the camp in northeastern Syria, Al-Hol camp, that was hosting basically families associated with terrorist groups. So we've seen a looser security setup around the camp, and we all read reports about some of the prisoners or IDPs, you call them as you want, basically being able to flee the camp. We've seen similar issues in prisons as well, in detention centers, but here I'm specifically highlighting the case of Al-Hol and what happened inside that camp. Coming to the issue of women and girls, we've seen again an exacerbation of existing problems, but the pandemic also added some specific elements to this. For example, we know that at least in Iraq, if not in other places as well, a lot of women were denied access to treatment or even to confinement, to quarantine, without a mahram, without a male escort, basically. That was limited to some communities, but it did happen. It did happen in several locations of Iraq, and there were even media reports about it. On a wider scale, we're all reading and following how the number of GBV cases, gender-based violence and domestic violence cases, are increasing because of the confinement. And we're seeing also the impact of the pandemic on reproductive health and other gender-based services. So among the vulnerable groups, I specifically decided to highlight the case of the refugees and IDPs, but also the women and girls, which I think were mostly affected by this pandemic. This is not to say that other vulnerable groups were not affected. It's just, it's just about highlighting these two cases more specifically. Next slide is about the impact on the legitimacy. So, in the region, we're pretty much used to the fact that there are grievances against the state. And I guess with time, this became some sort of a worldwide trend, that citizens are not happy with the state performance in general. However, in the specific case of the MENA region, because the pre-pandemic period was already, full of conflicts, some of them were violent, some others were not violent, but still, latent conflicts. the pandemic had a bigger impact on that specific issue. So as I said, there is a trust deficit causing an erosion of the social contract between the state and the society in general. Iraq is one example. Especially in the last few days, people in Iraq realized that they were misled by the authorities. The very sharp rise in the number of cases in the last few days has added a lot to the already significant amount of grievances that existed before that. We've seen also some signs of this in Iran and other places. The second, and which I think is even more important aspect, is the questioning of the traditional social structures. So in the region, we've been used to the fact that in general, the performance of state institutions is poor. And to compensate for this gap, many communities in the region relied on their own social structures. And this has worked in many cases. Whether we like it or not, whether this is good or not, is a different discussion, but it worked in several cases. So we've seen a lot of traditional social structures, whether tribal, family, parties, religious groups, whatever is there. They were able to fill in the gap left by the state institutions. What is happening now is an increased questioning of the relevance of these traditional social structures. We've seen, for example, that the very famous tribal structure or tribal leaders in Iraq were not able to help their communities, during this pandemic, during this crisis. We've seen, for example, religious groups in Lebanon not being able to help their constituencies. With the exception of Hezbollah, which enjoys a very wide array of resources, but all the other, sectarian or ideological parties in Lebanon were not able to fill in the gap left by the government. And this is leading to a questioning of the relevance and the value of these traditional structures. And obviously, because these structures played an important role in both peace and conflict in the region, I think that this questioning process will affect how conflicts will look like in the future. The next slide, I will talk a little bit about how the pandemic is being exploited by some actors. So there are some governments in the region who are using the pandemic as an opportunity, and the fact that the international community is busy doing other things to increase their repressive practices, if I can call it like this, or to make military gains. For example, in Libya, we're seeing an offensive by the government of national accord to make military gains at a time when the international community is, as I said, is busy doing other things. The security actors in the region are also exploiting the crisis in some way. So we are seeing a continued or a consistent pattern of monitoring, surveillance, and at least this is still at the level of the media and attempts by some security actors. But in this time of crisis, I think even the fact that these security actors are planning or thinking about how to reinforce or strengthen their surveillance techniques is worrisome by itself, even though it did not materialize in many cases. But the fact that there is a discussion about it, and there is some sort of an acceptance of the fact that because of the pandemic, now the security actors should have a larger space or more space to do what they deem as necessary measures. But this is a slippery slope, obviously. And I think that in the region, we need to be really careful about how this will unfold in the future. And last but not least is the non-state actors. Well, obviously, among usually we refer to the non-state actors as being the militias and extremist groups, but conceptually, non-state actors include also, the the good cops, if I can call them like this. So, as I said, the social structures that I described before are part of the non-state actors. Some of them are trying to fill in the gaps, but as I said, it's mostly unsuccessful. However, what is more worrisome is how the armed non-state actors are dealing or are trying to exploit the pandemic. The best example I can give is how ISIS sleeping cells in some parts of Iraq and Syria are now regaining some of their operational capacity because they're basically cultivating this sense of grievance among the communities. We all know that without some sort of a cover by the local community or the grassroots, these groups are not able to operate. And the fact that they have increased their operational capacity is an indicator by itself. So on the map, you can see the 3 places that I will cover in the next couple of slides, which is Libya, Syria, and Yemen. And here I'll talk about how the pandemic is basically affecting the conflicts in these 3 countries. So in the next slide, you will see in Libya, for example, as I mentioned before, the pandemic measures and crisis has been used as an opportunity to escalate and to initiate basically a military campaign aiming at reversing or changing the military's status quo that existed before the pandemic. And both the pandemic and the escalation basically have negatively affected the humanitarian situation in this country. In Syria, we're seeing the same fragmentation that existed before, but what is particular about it right now is that it's hampering the response. And what is interesting in the Syrian case that the response is also compounding the fragmentation. So there is a divide about who responds to what and what is a successful response, and this is fueling the political fragmentation, which by itself, as a fragmentation, as I said before, is hampering the proper response. In the case of Yemen, despite the fact that we've seen an attempt by the Saudis to declare a ceasefire, but obviously, as we're all reading and following, this ceasefire did not hold. The military operations are ongoing in Yemen. And even though it might look that the situation is better, but I was surprised even myself to know that in the last few months, there were 40,000 more IDPs in Yemen, which means that the intensity of the conflict did not really fade down. So we are seeing a continued military operation in Yemen and more displacement. And obviously, there is also the fact that the deterioration in the south happened during the pandemic. So we've seen the council in the south basically declaring autonomy in Yemen during the pandemic. And while the regional and international actors did not have enough bandwidth to attend to this kind of problems. How this will affect the global and regional orders? I tried to list some opportunities and challenges, but I can tell you that I tend to believe that the challenges are much more realistic than the opportunities. But even from an analytical perspective, I thought it might be relevant to list the opportunities that this pandemic might present. although I do not believe that they are very realistic. But for example, just to instill some sense of optimism, so the pandemic can basically lay the foundation for transnational collaboration. And this is usually motivated by a sense of mutual gain, to not only to fight the pandemic, but also to deal with the aftermath of the pandemic. Like, let's say, the economic crisis that everyone is predicting, or that already started actually. So transnational collaboration could be an opportunity to deal with such a crisis. We can also, or we could see a change in the concept of citizenship, in the sense that global citizenship might transcend the conventional definition of citizenship for a period of time. We've seen that the virus can travel anywhere, anytime, that the transmission mode is not conditioned by any kind of affiliation, neither to a country nor to a religious, ethnic, or otherwise groups. So in some cases, this could basically strengthen the case for global citizenship. We can also see, at least theoretically, a cooperation post-pandemic that can spill over into other sectors. So we've seen some countries actually cooperating strictly on the pandemic issue. But this momentum can be used also to trigger cooperation that goes beyond the pandemic itself, that could touch on humanitarian issues, or natural resources management, or even security, etc. And the pandemic can also be used as an opportunity for the leaders to revisit some of their practices. I'm talking about the political leaders here. To revisit some of their practices and correct them, and therefore initiate a trust-building process with their constituencies. Again, as I said, this might look overly optimistic or even naive in some cases. So let me move on to the challenges that are, as you see, more realistic, and actually some of them are already happening. So for example, the pandemic has definitely shifted the priorities of many countries. So we've seen that, for example, peace talks have been stalled, ceasefires, although with the exception of the Saudis, but usually the whole dynamic about a global ceasefire did not really materialize in anything positive. The fact that the oil revenues are now in danger will heavily affect the economies in the region. Not only the oil-producing countries, but also the other countries in the region who are somehow benefiting from the dividends of the oil revenues in those countries. So let's take, for example, the number of foreign workers in the GCC countries. As the GCC countries are getting into an economic crisis, they will have to basically terminate or lay off a lot of jobs, which will affect countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and others. There is, here I put it more politically correct, the potential for increased isolationism, but we are seeing this already happening. It's not a potential anymore, it's something that is already happening. So there are reactions in some countries, basically, that could be categorized as going towards more isolation, more clustering, less exchange, less exchanges at all levels with other communities or even other countries. We've seen, I witnessed personally in Lebanon a lot of attempts by municipalities, for example, to basically impose a curfew on specific nationalities or specific religious groups, which was, in the 21st century is something that is hard to imagine. Moving to other challenges, so some nations may leverage the humanitarian aid they provided. More specifically, I'm talking about how Russia and China jumped in to help in some cases, but with very, very clear agendas that will unfold in the near future. And this will obviously have an impact on the regional order, as these two powers exercise more leverage on the politics in the region. There is definitely, and this is already something already happening, questioning of the utility and the relevance of the intergovernmental bodies. We've seen in the beginning of the pandemic how, the Italians and the Spanish population basically were questioning the utility of the European Union. At a time when Italy was struggling with the pandemic, the EU was discussing whether they want to help them or not. In the meanwhile, China jumped in and provided immediate support. So this has triggered a lot of questions about the concept, the very concept of the European Union, and whether if the concept doesn't work in a crisis like this, then when is it going to be useful? More recently, we've seen the debate about the performance, but also the relevance of an organization like the World Health Organization, with all the questions about the fact that they are politically subdued by the Chinese, and or whether they were competent or incompetent in identifying the nature of the virus and the mode of transmission and what the government should be taking in terms of measures. Now, if this trend increases, then definitely some of these intergovernmental bodies will become less relevant or less legitimate, and this will affect, as I said, the regional order. I did discuss before how countries are exploiting the crisis. Although what I covered before was mostly internal, but some of them are trying to exploit the crisis to reorder global and regional order. The best example is Turkey and the increased activity of Turkey in the Mediterranean and in Libya. Obviously, the increased migration will remain and will become an even stronger destabilizing factor. Sorry. That was my last slide. So I'll stop here and thank you again, and thank Gerhard Center for hosting me, and I stand ready to answer the questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Eli. I have a few pointers I just want to sort of raise, and that's going to give Kariman a little bit of a chance to sort of collect the questions from the participants. My first observation is that you're really, with the exception of Tunisia and maybe Lebanon, most of your examples and focus are about failed states. When I talk about failed states, I mean, you could easily consider, I mean, Yemen, Iraq, even Libya, Syria to a large extent is a failed state. When you talk about a failed state, this means that the solution is not within. The solution most of the time is with the other powers that are struggling, that has sort of interest in this state. Now, the interesting part which you've mentioned is that with the current disruption, there is a clear, the world is becoming less dominant by two or three powers like before. The Americans are probably very consumed with their own internal problems. The Chinese are not ready yet, even though they're doing things. So you're going to find what you've mentioned, there is a more trend toward regionalization. You're going to find that there are regional powers that's going to sort of come and it's going to try to sort of grab more. An example is Turkey, an example is Iran, an example is Ethiopia. There are many examples of such a thing. So you might talk about different solutions for the failed states. But I don't want to get into this because this is really a political science discussion. I'm more interested in from a social impact, or what could be done from a social perspective, or social coherence, or social solidarity. The major issue you're talking about had to do with two things. The first thing is the governance issue. A major issue in governance is inclusiveness and rule of law. Inclusiveness is more important than rule of law, because I could argue, like in the US, for example, there is a very high sense of rule of law, but the rule is rigged against specific minorities. And that sort of takes the inclusiveness part out. The other thing which is very interesting, we need to focus about, is the culture, the mindset. As a human beings, we don't have affinity toward the others. We tend to sort of abhor the others. The other could be anything. It could be somebody who's a different religion, different belief, different ethnicity, different color. And again, this is part of defining what the culture is, accepting more of the other. And I think when we talk about civil society organizations or people interested in promoting social coherence, which is what we're trying to achieve, you really have to play on both. Now, obviously, the inclusive part is probably harder because there is a political issues with it. But the other part is could actually be easier. That you start try to sort of, through education, through subtle messages, promote the concept of accepting the other, of concept of citizenship. So I just wanted to sort of get your opinion about this.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, very interesting points that you raised, Dr. Ali, as usual. I definitely agree with you that it is mostly a governance issue. The only reason why I didn't really get into this, because the angle that I was covering in this specific session was more about the conflicts and fragility rather than talking about the governance in general. But in another webinar that was more about human rights and the pandemic, I did touch on the governance extensively. So I fully agree with you. It's essentially an issue with the governance and the fact that most of the governance models in the region are not inclusive. I think that's a fact. And this has affected how the people respond to the pandemic, how the authorities respond to the pandemic, and this will determine also how the communities will deal with the post-pandemic phase. So on this point, I fully agree with you. Now, on the point of regional powers or regionalization, if I got you right, I might slightly disagree. Not to the fact that regional powers will try to step in. I fully see already this happening. But where I don't see them really playing a stronger role is because of how strong the post-pandemic will hit them. Actually, if you look at Iran today, the Iranians are really heavily affected by the pandemic, and they will be even more affected by the economic crisis that will follow that. The same applies to Turkey, definitely to a lesser extent than Iran. The GCC countries, who are also a regional player and who are trying to carve out a role for them in some parts of the region, will be also heavily impeded by the fluctuating oil revenues. So yes, theoretically, there will be a space for regional powers to step in. But in practice, because of what will happen in the next few years in terms of economic recession and other crises, I don't see this, being a major game changer, if I put it this way. Thank you.
Sure. Kariman, do you have any questions from the audience? Please do.
Yes, thank you, Eli. Thank you, Dr. Ali. Eli, please, we'd like to hear your views about the passivity of the international peace-building community witnessing the COVID-19 being weaponized through applying economic sanctions. As you know, economic sanctions could be considered violence, especially at the time of pandemic. Don't you think that this is an opportunity lost in peace building that international organization could have seized? Thank you.
Yeah. So are we taking a round of questions or one question at a time?
You would like to take it like in rounds? I can.
No, I don't mind. I'm just asking. I can do both. I'm just asking.
Okay. So, okay, I will give you a chance to answer this question until I collect something.
Okay. So I usually don't like collective judgments. So I don't think that all the international peace building community is embracing one approach or the other. I think there are different approaches. Some peace building organizations are very actively advocating against economic sanctions. Others are less enthusiastic about this because there is a view that the recent model of economic sanctions are somehow smart, and they were able to basically mitigate the negative effect that we've seen in previous waves of economic sanctions. Now, whether this point of view is right or not is a different discussion. So I'm not going to get into the technicalities of economic sanctions. But to answer the question, I don't think that there is one position by the international peace building community. There are multiple positions, ranging from being really, opposed to any kind of economic sanctions, or being somehow, or somehow tolerating these sanctions in their present form. Now, whether economic sanctions in times of pandemic is a relevant tool, I can give you a personal opinion. I don't think that economic sanctions in a time of pandemic are relevant and ethical. So there is a need to revisit whenever the international community is imposing economic sanctions. There should be an effort to revisit the impact, the scope of these sanctions, the impact of these sanctions on the communities in a post-COVID situation, and either adjust or completely eliminate these sanctions. However, there is also a responsibility on the regimes that are the reason for these sanctions to happen. So we all know that usually these sanctions do not come out of nowhere. There are specific behaviors of certain regimes that usually trigger these sanctions. And I guess as much as the international community is responsible to revisit the scope and the impact of these sanctions, there's also a responsibility on these regimes to revisit their behavior and make it less provocative to the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. Another question: do you think the fact that the white supremacy groups became more vocal lately will trigger more extremism in the region? If yes, what can an institution like yours do to control the negative impact of that? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Quite a timely question. Honestly, at least based on my own experience, I did not witness a very strong correlation between the evolution of white supremacist groups in North America or in the West in general and what's happening in the region. There might be some some sort of a relationship between both, but I never saw it, or I never witnessed a direct relationship between both trends. In general, as many other people believe and say, I do also believe that any form of extremism will trigger counter-extremism. Will trigger another type of extremism. And we get into a vicious circle. So theoretically, yes, the more the white supremacist groups will be present or active in the West, the higher the risk is for extremist groups to thrive in their communities. But again, I don't see a very strong relationship with the region per se. Thank you.
What do you think international and regional organizations need to do to address discrimination against women in COVID-19?
Well, I think they should do what they should be doing to address the discrimination against women in general. This pandemic, as I said before, it had an impact or a greater impact on women and on women more specifically. But the root causes of the discrimination and the forms of the discrimination are the same. They are the same. It's the same type of discrimination that we've seen before and that we'll see in the future. What organizations should be doing is, this is something I used to say even before the pandemic, is to focus on the social change aspect of the fight against discrimination, rather than just focusing on top-down approaches. I do think that, and I've seen some efforts. I'm not saying that this didn't exist. I'm just saying that this needs to be more emphasized. More resources should be allocated to this type of work, which involves or engages the communities in countering discrimination against women, and more specifically in working extensensively with men to address the issue of discrimination, rather than just keep it for women-only groups, which I was never convinced that that was an effective approach. Thank you.
How can peace be negotiated in communities that are structurally designed on basis of injustice and unequal distribution of power? Witnessing what's happening with the Black communities in the United States these days, do you think there should be a radical structural change in terms of institutions?
Yeah, thank you. Well, conceptually, any peace process should be addressing the structural issues of inequality and discrimination and non-inclusiveness. And if we have a society or a community that does not have inequality, injustice, or other issues, then it's very unlikely that they will get into a violent conflict. So by the mere fact that we are considering a peace process in a given country or a given location, then this automatically means that these communities are suffering from inequality, injustice, and other issues. And any successful peace process should include ways to address these issues. Otherwise, it will end up being just a ceasefire rather than a peace process. And we've seen a lot of conflicts that were put on hold for a specific period of time, and then they picked up again as soon as the overall context has changed, because these structural issues were not addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you think that the COVID response in MENA has been adequate? This has been handled as a health issue and not as a national security. Also, have you seen any resilience program to help communities come out of the lockdowns?
Sorry, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Sorry.
I got the first one.
Sorry. Oh, have you seen any resilience program to help communities come out of the lockdown?
Okay, well, let me answer the first half of the question. I think it's unfair to, to put all the MENA countries and assess their response in one basket. I think there were some successful responses and less successful responses, depending on the country, and in some cases, depending on the local authorities. Even in a small area, small region, like the Kurdistan region of Iraq, there is a division between two provinces on how to handle the confinement measures. So I think that In some cases, we've seen successful responses. Again, the scope of the response is also conditioned by the availability of resources. So in some cases, like in Tunisia, for example, we've seen a more or less good plan designed by the government, but lack of resources to implement some elements of that plan. In other cases, the plan was not as good. So it's really, it has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. But what I would like to highlight in this is the lack of discipline that we have seen in the region. You know, in some cases, the governments took the right measures to either impose lockdowns or confinement measures, or, you know, I don't know, measures at the airports, etc. But we've seen in many cases, I don't want to generalize again, but in many cases, we've seen a very low level of compliance or discipline by the communities. And this has caused actually in some spikes in the number of cases. So if there's anything that this pandemic has strengthened, any message, is that the top-down approach is never enough. If the community does not take a responsibility of a decision, an action, a plan, or whatever, then the implementation will always, or the outcome will always be flawed. So there is an increased need that has been highlighted by this pandemic to enhance the civil-military cooperation, to involve the civilian component of the community more in the human security approaches. So there are a lot of reforms that are needed in this respect. Again, these reforms were mentioned before by many scholars and many policymakers. So I'm not inventing something new here, but I'm just highlighting the fact that this pandemic has definitely showed that these reforms are you know, essential and necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eli. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, although we have some other questions. So the next time, inshallah. Thank you so much. Dr. Ali, could you
Thank you very much.
Eli, thank you for addressing a very interesting and a timing topic. And as you can see, I mean, we could sort of discuss it until next week, but we have a limited time. But I really appreciate your presentation. I appreciate your coming and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you. Now,
thank you very much.
For the audience, we have next week, we have very interesting topics and speakers like the previous ones. On Tuesday, we're going to have Ayman Tarabishi. He's going to talk about the end of the status quo. Ayman is in George Washington University in DC, and he's affiliated with the International Council for Small Businesses. He's going to talk more about, I mean, you probably have heard us talking about the entrepreneurship model advocated by most schools is very elitist. What Ayman is going to talk about is that we should be more promoting inclusive approach that support micro and small enterprises. And the idea here is not such as creating innovation as such. It's more of creating decent jobs. It's more of creating decent enterprises that are capable of supporting the people. So this is what's going to be on Tuesday. Now, on Wednesday, we're going to have Jeffrey Sachs. Now, Jeffrey Sachs is going to talk about the SDGs in the aftermath of the COVID-19. Now, if anybody knows Jeffrey Sachs, he's pretty much the guru and the brain mind behind the MDGs and the SDGs. And what we're trying to ask him is, well, in the aftermath of the COVID-19, what do we do with the SDGs? So should we fine-tune them? Should we revamp? What should be done? So stay tuned, and we hope to see you all soon next week, inshallah. Again, thank you, Eli, and I look forward to seeing you in future events, inshallah. Thank you. Thank you, Kariman.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kariman. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.